JCT Quilting, and I want to help you turn your memories into quilted treasures. In this video, I'm going to share how I made the traditional tees quilt. So let's get started by talking about the fabric and the tools that I used. Here are the supplies that I need for this project. I have 12 shirts, and whenever I'm pressing shirts, I use a Teflon mat or a silicone mat, or you can use a moist dishcloth, something along those lines, as a barrier between the shirts. I'm also using interfacing and your heating element. This just protects your shirts, it protects the decals, it protects your heating element from accidentally picking up the bumps from the interfacing. It's just nice to have that layer of protection when working with a t-shirt quilt. I'm using a Pellin lightweight fusible interfacing, and then this is my backing and my sashing fabric. It's kind of a sweatshirt material, so that's what I'll be using for the sashing in between the shirts and the back of the quilt. And then I have my binding clips. I prefer binding clips over pins. I find that they hold my stuff together better without moving the fabrics. I also like that I can switch which fabric is closer to the feed dogs after I've pinned it or clipped it together. With pins, if you were to switch, so for example, if you pin it with the t-shirt on top, planning for the t-shirt to be on top, and then you decide to put the sashing fabric on top, you have to repin it, or the pins are underneath and you can't, it's harder to get them out. With clips, you could flip it over and it's not a big deal. The clips are still easily accessible and you can just take them out while you're sewing. So I prefer clips. You could also use pins. I also have my roller. I like to use a roller so that I don't have to use the heat every time I need to press the seam. So something like this, which is a nice heavy duty roller, will get a good press on the t-shirts and on what other fabric you're using, and you don't have to go iron it every time. Again, because we're working with precious memories and precious shirts, it's not always ideal to use an iron every single time we want to press the seam. So I like to use a roller in between and then maybe save the iron for when the whole row is pressed or something along those lines. You also want your trusty rotary blade. I actually recommend not changing your blade until after your initial cut of your shirts. You first rough cut your shirts and then you do your interfacing, and then you will cut your shirts to size. When you're cutting them to size, that's a good step to change out your rotary blade. If you remember, I'm not always good about that. The other time that I recommend changing out your blade is when you're trimming the quilt. So after you quilt it, when you're preparing it for binding, that's a good time to use a sharp rotary blade so that you have nice crisp edges for your binding. Either one of those are a great time. With a t-shirt quilt, I do not recommend switching the blade out at the beginning of the project. And then lastly, you're going to want some rulers. I like this 16.5 by 16.5 large square ruler. I use it a lot with my t-shirt quilts. It comes in very handy. It's a really great size, and it usually can encompass the whole shirt, and I can see through it enough to make sure that my decals are centered just how I want them. I also like to use a little ruler as a straight edge. For example, when I'm trimming my sashing or I'm making my binding, something along those lines, if you're using more than one ruler, you want to make sure that they measure the inch in the same way. It's not uncommon for rulers to be slightly different, maybe even a hair off in the inches. They could also be the same, but sometimes they're a little off. So you just want to double check that if you're going to use multiple rulers for measuring and cutting. That little hair or that little bit being off could change your quilt from precisely lining up if that is something you're worried about. Usually with t-shirt quilts, there's forgiveness built in. I find that they're forgiving because you could always get even with interfacing, you can get a little stretch out of them to make them fit, but it's still a good rule of thumb to make sure your rulers work together. In this case, I'm not really using the little one for measuring. I'm using it more as a smaller straight edge, but I have checked, and these are from the same company, which is usually a good indication that they will align with each other. But I've also checked, and these two are compatible and I enjoy using them together. In addition to these supplies, I will also be using my iron, and I have a t-shirt press that I use when interfacing the shirts. It just makes the interfacing process go faster. And then I use my sewing machine. For information about how much fabric you need specifically for sashing, for backing, how many shirts you need, go ahead and check out the free pattern that is linked. and that will give you more information about how to make that determination. For this quilt, I need to cut my t-shirts to 15.5 by 15.5 inches, so I'm going to cut my interfacing to approximately 16 by 16 inches. This will help ensure the interfacing fully covers the t-shirt once it's cut. Since the interfacing is all the same size, I was able to stack and cut multiple pieces at the same time. I'm going to set aside these offcuts and use them in a future project. Now it's time for the rough cut of the shirts. At this point, you want to cut the shirts approximately 1 to 2 inches bigger than what you will need them to be for their final size. So in this case, I need them to be 15.5 by 15.5. Since I have a 16.5 inch square ruler, I'm going to use that. So I'm just going to cut the shirts to 16.5 by 16.5. I like to start by cutting off the sleeves, and then I will cut up the sides of the shirt. You can use fabric scissors or a rotary blade to do this. You can also use a straight edge with your rotary blade if you prefer. Once the sides are cut, I cut across the top of the shirt to separate the back and the front of the shirt. Then I use my large square ruler to rough cut the t-shirt. Remember, I'm cutting it to 16.5 by 16.5, even though my final size will be 15.5 by 15.5. I try to center the decal because if I center it at this point, it will be easier to center when I make my final cuts. To make this cut, I will cut on the right side and the top side, so I'm not cutting towards myself. Then I'll remove the ruler, flip the shirt. Now the shirt's upside down, and then I will again proceed to cut on the right side and across the top, but this time it's the remaining 2 sides that have not yet been cut. Now all 4 sides have been cut, so this shirt is ready to be interfaced. I follow the same process to prepare all of the shirts for this quilt. When I'm cutting, I like to set aside the bigger pieces of the offcuts or the t-shirt scraps in case I want to use them for a future project. Now it's time to attach the interfacing to all of the shirts. When attaching interfacing, I put the interfacing with the bumpy side towards the back of the t-shirt. I also like to lay the front of the t-shirt towards a silicone mat that is on my ironing board. This just protects the shirt and the ironing board in case something happens while the shirt is getting warmed. I also use a protective layer between the iron and the back of the interfacing. You can use silicone mat, you can use a Teflon mat, you can use a moist towel. You will just want to use a protective layer to at least protect the decal of your shirt. When pressing, you want to hold the iron over each spot along the back of the shirt for approximately 10 to 15 seconds. You want it to get warm enough for that glue, those bumps on the interfacing, to open up and adhere to the back of the shirt. Typically when I'm attaching interfacing, I don't use my iron, but I use a t-shirt press. If you're going to make a lot of t-shirt quilts, I highly recommend investing in a t-shirt press. It makes this interfacing process go a lot faster and a lot smoother. I also find the interfacing adheres much better with the additional heat of the t-shirt press. My t-shirt press is approximately 15 by 15 inches, so for these shirts that are 16.5 by 16.5, it does take me 4 times to get the whole shirt, but it is still faster than holding an iron over each area of the shirt. After the shirts are interfaced, I let them cool completely before I bring them to the cutting mat. The heat from the shirts could warp the cutting mat, and I don't want that to happen. When cutting the shirts to their final size, in this case 15.5 by 15.5, I use the same strategy of cutting the right side and the top, and then I flip the shirt so that I'm again cutting the right and the top, but this time it's the other side and the bottom. I do my best to center the decal in the shirt, but often, especially in the vertical direction, it's hard to center the decal. You will find that often on shirts the decal sits higher than the center, and because of the collar that we probably aren't using in the t-shirt quilt, the decal will end up being lower than where we would like. This is okay, and it won't negatively impact your overall look of your t-shirt quilt. It's just something to keep in mind as you're cutting your shirts. Even though the shirts are all being cut to the same size, you want to cut them one at a time and don't stack them for cutting. If I were to stack them, it would be hard to center the decal, and I enjoy the look of a centered decal, so that does not work for me. If you were cutting shirts that don't have decals or you don't care where the decal is located, then you could stack them 2 to 3 high and cut more than one at a time. Now it's time to cut and prepare the sashing. I'm using 3.5 inch sashing for this project. This gray sweatshirt fabric that I'm using is not like typical 42 inch wide fabric. When I folded it in half, its measurement was too big for using my regular ruler that I've been using to cut the shirts, and it was too thick to fold it more than twice and get a good clean cut. So I'm using this other ruler, and I did first make sure that the rulers were on the same page, that they use the same inch measurement. When cutting your sashing, you want to make sure you're cutting consistently. Pay attention to where your ruler is lined up Are you lining it up on the inside of the 3.5 inch line or on the outside? And do that consistently for all of the cuts. You also want to do it consistently for your t-shirt cuts so that the measurements are the same throughout the whole project. You'll also notice that I'm using my ruler for cutting and for measuring, and I'm not using my cutting mat for the 3.5 inch measuring. The cutting mat can be warped and it could be damaged, and the measurements could be a little off, so the ruler is going to be your more accurate tool for measuring when you're cutting strips. Again, since this fabric was not a typical 42 inch wide fabric, the number of strips that I needed differs slightly from what is written in the pattern. If you want to know how many strips you need to cut, I recommend checking out the pattern, which is linked in the description below. Once I have all of my 3.5 inch strips, I can then cut them to the size that I need for the pattern. I can cut them to the 16.5 inches that I need for the vertical sashing, and I can cut them to the size that I need for the horizontal sashing. For those longer horizontal sashing strips, it can be hard to cut that accurately, especially if your cutting mat is not as wide as what you need for that cut. In those cases, I recommend doing your best. You can also leave the sashing strip extra long and then cut it off once you have attached it to the fabric so that it will be cut to the size you need. The risk you run by doing this, especially with a t-shirt quilt, is that your t-shirt could have a little stretch even if it's interfaced, or you could just pull on the fabric too much while you're piecing and it will cause some warp or some waves in the fabric because it wasn't to the size that it needed to be. So just be mindful of this. Do your best not to pull the fabric when you are piecing, and try to do your best to make accurate cuts. As I said earlier, the most important thing is to be consistent, so watch how you're using your ruler, where you're making your measurements, and where you're making your cut. Now it's time for piecing. I'm going to piece a row at a time, and I'm going to start by attaching the sashing strip, the vertical sashing strip, to the right side of the shirts. When you're piecing a row at a time, you do not want to sew your first two and then continuously add to that. You want to sew in pairs and then sew those pairs together until your whole row is sewn. If you were to sew just one long piece where you're continuously adding the next piece and the next piece, you might find that by the time you get to the end, it's a little wonky or a little slanted. If you can do it in pieces or pairs, where you're sewing two pieces together and then the next two together, and then you sew those pairs together two at a time, you will find that you won't have as much wonkiness or angles or warping that can happen. If you like to chain piece, this is a good time for that. You can finish stitching one, leave the needle down, leave the thread down, don't cut it, and then start your next one and keep going. Sometimes I will do this, sometimes I won't. In this case, I didn't want to forget the order of the shirts, so I did not do them all at the same time. I decided to use my seam roller to roll out the seams and to flatten them instead of going back and forth to the iron. I didn't want to put these shirts with these big decals under the iron constantly, and with that thicker sweatshirt fabric for the sashing, the seam roller worked great to flatten these seams, and that sweatshirt sashing really held its own. When I'm pressing seams with a seam roller or an iron, whenever I'm using sashing with a t-shirt, I always press to the sashing. I have found that the t-shirt is not as pliable. It doesn't like to bend as much for those seams, whereas the sashing fabric is more pliable typically and doesn't mind the bend. So I have found that I prefer, when possible, to press to the sashing fabric. Another thing you might notice is that when I first attach the sashing, I may or may not use clips. I don't do that consistently. However, once the sashing is attached and then I'm attaching that pair to the next pair, I do use clips. At that point, I want to make sure my piecing is accurate. I want to make sure the shirts are lined up and the right height. And so I'm going to use clips just to hold everything in place while I'm stitching that seam. I'm going to follow this pattern of attaching the sashing to the shirt, calling that a pair, moving on to the next pair, and then sewing those pairs together. And I'll continue to follow that pattern until the whole row is sewn. first row is now pieced. It's time to do the same process for the other rows. The rows are pieced, so now it's time to add the sashing strips. I've pre-cut these strips so that they are to the size that they should be. This will help when I'm piecing to ensure that I don't stretch those shirts, I don't accidentally pull them or stretch them out of size. This will also help ensure that each row is consistent, which will help when I'm piecing the rows with the sashing to the other row with its sashing to make sure it's a consistent width and they all match up nicely. An alternative method is to piece the sashing on and then trim it to size after it's pieced. So maybe cut it to bigger than what you need and then cut it to the precise size once it's sewn on. The issue that you can run into with doing it with this method is that you could inadvertently pull the shirts, pull the sashing, make it a little wider than you need, and then when you're trying to sew the rows together, you might find that one row is a little longer or a little shorter than the other rows. So if you're going to use that method, just be mindful to not give the shirts an extra tug, don't pull, just let the fabric go through the machine as it normally would. Since my sashing strips are pre-cut to the appropriate size, I'm going to use clips. This helps maintain while I'm sewing, it just keeps them where they are. I find that when I don't use clips, I do sometimes get to the end and it turns out I have pulled the shirts a little or something is a little off so the sashing doesn't line up with the end of the shirt. If I use clips and just space them every so often, then I get to the end and the sashing strip and the shirt end at the same place just as I want them to be. For the location of the clips, it's user preference. I put one on each end and then I put one on the end of each, not on the side where I'm sewing, but on the other side, the perpendicular side. I find that that one holds it in place so that when I'm starting or when I'm finishing and I have to remove that clip, it still keeps it in place because I have that clip on the perpendicular side. I also put clips when it's crossing seams. I just find that it helps to clip those areas, and I will use clips in between those clips if the space is too big. Just like when we're piecing the rows, it's helpful if you can do these in pairs. So do a row of shirts with a row of sashing, do a row of shirts with another row of sashing, and then put those pairs together. This will help ensure that overall it's not wonky or tilted. It just keeps everything in line a lot better. Now you will find that there is one row that will need two sides of sashing, because either the top row or the bottom row will need both sides. So you can pick either one. In this case, I picked the bottom row and I put sashing, I clipped it to the top and I clipped it to the bottom. For the other rows of shirts, I am clipping the sashing to the top. Sometimes you have an odd number, so you can't do pairs until the end, and that's fine. What you're trying to avoid is sewing, attaching a piece, attaching a piece, attaching a piece, and continuing in that. It will lead to overall wonkiness or tilt. Now it's time to take these to the machine and sew them together. The sashing is attached to the rows of the shirts, so now it's time to piece these pairs, these row pairs together. Just as when I lined up the sashing, I'm going to line up the shirts and use clips. The extra step here is I'm going to try to make that vertical sashing line up. Now, if it doesn't line up perfectly, it's okay. No one's going to know it was supposed to be perfect except for you. And especially with t-shirt quilts, I find that people are so wrapped up in the memories that they don't pay attention to those quilting details that us quilters pay attention to. So there is a little more freedom, I find, with t-shirt quilts than with regular quilts because we are so caught up in the memories and the nostalgia that seams not matching perfectly or things like that are really not noticed. Also, if they're a little off, sometimes the quilting will take care of that and the piecing will just fall by the wayside because, again, you'll see the memories, you'll see the quilting, and it will just be forgotten if they're not perfectly lined up. With that said, if you want to line them up, I recommend clip your ends together, hold those in place so that you have the length taken care of. Then you're going to start to feel where those lines are and you're going to almost nest them. There is that horizontal sashing, so you can't nest right at the edge, but you can come in a few inches or however big your sashing is and you can feel it. I also like to fold back the fabric and make sure it's lined up, and then I just use my hands to kind of feel that it's nesting and then clip it in place. Now, if you've been precise with your cutting, with your measurements, with your piecing, this should just line up naturally. But I do find that it helps to still get a feel for it, still put clips on both of those seams, just to make sure it all stays in place while I'm sewing. But really the key to these lining up is the precise piecing and the precise cutting that happens way before this step. In addition to clipping on those seams, you're going to want to add clips in between those seams so that you don't have huge gaps where you're sewing where stuff is not clipped. And again, you're just clipping to try to keep those fabrics in place as you're sewing along. So I'm going to continue to clip my rows. Again, I'm doing 2 pairs. So I had 4 rows. I pieced each of the rows the sashing to the shirts. Then in those pairs, I pieced 2 pairs together, or I'm clipping 2 rows together at this point so that I can piece them. And then I will clip the next 2 rows together, the next 2 pairs together. When I'm sewing these rows together, I am making sure to not pull either the top fabric or the bottom fabric. I want them to go in sync together through the machine. Sometimes I find that if I have an option, I will put the t-shirt on the bottom. The stabilized shirt goes on the bottom closer to the feed dogs, and I find that that helps. In this case, because the sashing was that sweatshirt fabric, either way worked, and I found that it went through the machine in the same way. As I'm going along, I am continuing to make sure those seams are nesting, so I will just pause and feel them as I come across those seams where there is nesting or where I want the sashing to nest, and I'm just making sure they're still in line. Once those row pairs are pieced together, then I'm ready for the last pairing. I will clip those pairs together. So it's basically the top half of the quilt with the bottom half of the quilt. I'll follow the same process I used earlier for the clipping, and then I'll bring it over to the machine and piece it in the same way. Once the top and bottom half are pieced, now you just need the side sashing. Follow the same process with attaching sashing. Cut your pieces to size, sew them down each side, and then your quilt top is finished. Typically at this point, I would throw the quilt on my long arm or quilt it on my domestic machine and then apply the binding and then be done. This client, though, wanted it finished a different way. I put right sides together of the quilt top and the quilt back and put the batting where it needed to be, stitched around the edge, leaving a gap for me to turn it right side out, and then I top stitched around the edge to close that opening and to make it look seamless. You can still tell a little bit where that opening was. Then I top stitched around all of the shirts to apply some quilting. This method is not recommended. It will fall apart probably faster than a traditional quilt because the quilting is so far apart and because it doesn't have the binding on it, but it will still work. It's what they wanted, and it has the look that she wanted, which was based on a previous quilt that they had made. This is my finished Traditional Tees quilt. I hope this video was helpful as you made your own Traditional Tees quilt.